Thank you for stepping over that. I said thank you. Hello and welcome to the first design workshop of winter 2020. My name is Luke. I am a design officer, Luke Miller, and today we're going to talk about just some of the basic fundamental ideas of design through the lens of Hyperlight Drifter. Any questions? Anyone ever played Hyperlight Drifter?
I have.
That's a fun one. It's a nice little, just a little bit about Hyperlight Drifter. It's a 2D isometric perspective game where you're just trying to dodge around enemy attacks in order to deal attacks to them. Okay. Oh, yeah, this is Hyperlight Drifter. It has a fantastic art style, but I'm not an artist, so I guess I won't talk about that too much. 2D isometric game focused on either dealing with a large number of weak enemies or fighting one really powerful enemy, which that little dichotomy between either dealing with a lot of stuff on your screen or dealing with one thing that's really time consuming is a dichotomy that happens a lot in like these type of games where so like you see it in like these type of games being very broad, like Dark Souls, not even just the isometric, Dark Souls, Metroid games, Zelda type games, just a large number of them will either have you dealing with a bunch of stuff from enemies that you can deal with fairly easily, or one very large enemy that's doing very powerful attacks that you have to make sure you're not getting hit by. And I skipped a page. First thing we're going to talk about in Hyperlight Drifter is MDA. Does anyone know what MDA is, despite the fact that they're plainly written here?
I think I saw this a little bit in one of my brother's classes that I sat in on.
Yeah, so MDA is one of the core ideas of design, and if you take a lot of classes here at UCI, they will have talk about it a bunch, and it'll be in the later classes that'll be just something that they assume you know. And mechanics is basically the very raw bones of your game. It's how the player, what the player can do, and how the player what the game does. So if you have an enemy that moves back and forth, like the Goomba in Mario, then that mechanic is a Goomba that moves back and forth. And another mechanic might be, hey, your player can jump and your player can move. Those are two different separate mechanics. And then the mechanics start to combine together into dynamics, which form a feeling. So how does Hyperlight Drifter do mechanics? Here are the three main mechanics of Hyperlight Drifter. I wanted a GIF for each one, but GIFs are hard to find, and I'm terrible at making them. So you have your attack, which deals damage to the enemy, prevents you from moving a lot, so it does a lot of stuff. Your movement is slowed while you're attacking, and you can do it up to 3 times in a row, and then you take a short break. So it's very limiting in what you can do while you're attacking. And then you also have your dash/dodge, which you choose basically one of the 8 directions, depending on how good your controller is, and you dash a set amount of distance in that direction. There'll probably be something showing it later. Here is someone dashing. So basically it does a weird flash and then you move from one side to another. But you can still take damage while you're dashing, and you can still get hit, and you can still run into things. So if you dash directly into an enemy, then you just dashed directly into an enemy. You don't go past it or anything. You just run right into them. And then enemies can attack, which in a fighting game, hopefully both people can attack, or else you might run into a problem. Dynamics. I hope this is silent. My bad. Okay. So, but then it resets. And then now if I press play, it's going to start playing the music. Oh, not. So this is one of the first boss fights in Hyper Light Drifter. And as you can see, the enemy is attacking the player. The player is dashing around trying to dodge the attacks. This is a fairly skilled player. I think he beats it really easily. And so all those aspects are being combined. All the mechanics that I talked about earlier are being combined together in a way that allows the player a lot of freedom and a lot of stuff that they can do. And we can sit here and watch this, but that would probably be boring. And then aesthetics is when dynamics start working together, then it starts to create a very specific feeling or very broad feeling in the player. And so two aesthetics that I'm thinking about is if the player is unable to do the dashes and is hit a lot, then this will give them a feeling that hopefully it won't give them the feeling that this is bad. It'll give them the feeling that they need to learn. It'll give them the feeling that the world is dangerous and there's a lot of stuff that they have to deal with and that they should be careful. But if they are able to do it, especially if they are able to do it after not being able to do it originally, it gives them a feeling of success and improvement. Any questions about MDA? What mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics are? Can you think of any mechanics from other games that you might have played? You've played Zelda. That has a ton of mechanics.
I was thinking of Breath of the Wild and it was like, maybe I won't.
Think of what's a mechanic from Breath of the Wild?
Alright, a mechanic from Breath of the Wild is the time stop thing. Where you stop time.
For a period of time.
Yeah. And another mechanic, you stab thing.
Mm-hmm.
If you stab thing, that is stopped in time. They'll work together to make it go, woo.
Yeah, that would be a dynamic.
That would be a dynamic.
And then you can also stand on top of the thing you stabbed, and now that's another slightly different dynamic.
Exactly.
And if you do that, it gives you a really awesome feeling of flying through the sky on top of a log, and that's an aesthetic. Any other games?
Parrying in Dark Souls,
Yeah.
which I guess
Parrying's weird because it's kind of, as a mechanic, it kind of starts off as a dynamic because it requires two interacting mechanics. But like parrying is a mechanic where you swing your shield and whatever is attacking you doesn't attack you. It gets into a... What else were you going to say about it?
well, I was just gonna talk about it being a dynamic, but also I guess aesthetic-wise, it's really satisfying when you parry a really powerful hit, because I mean, A, it's hard to do and it doesn't work all the time, and B, just the animation and the animation is really powerful and it does a lot of damage.
Yeah. So that's something I didn't make slides for, but I was thinking about talking about since this is just like kind of an overview of all games. Something that really helps ingrain mechanics, dynamics, especially dynamics, and get them to create a certain aesthetic is not only how the dynamic works, but how you inform the player that the dynamic works. This is often called juice in game design. And so if you were watching Hyper Light Drifter, the attack is a very big swing, and you can see very easily where you're attacking. And for the dash, you've got like, it's very obvious that you're dashing. And so when you play it, the game, this is moderately art, but also design. The game is very intentive in telling you that you've done something, which is an important aspect of mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. If you have the greatest mechanics in the world and the greatest dynamics in the world, but you never tell the player that any of this stuff is happening, the player will not be able to get any feelings from it. So juice, or informing the player that stuff is going on, is a very important aspect of mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. But yeah, you're gonna say something. What is everyone's names?
My name's Roy.
Roy. Nice to meet you, Roy.
Oh, actually, strange.
What's your name?
Megan.
Nice to meet you, Megan. And you're
Will.
Will. Nice to meet you, Will. If I've met you before, sorry. That's Victor. He's a design
You
officer.
didn't ask me for my name?
What's
Wow.
your name, Victor?
Andrew.
Okay, that's Andrew. He is a design officer. Rory,
Yeah.
you were gonna talk about a game.
I was gonna say FTL and like their targeting system, and then how like when you actually like fire, then it's more of a dynamic because it's the like interacting with the enemy.
Yeah, and like, especially like, there's certain weapons in FTL that are specifically designed for like breaching holes or setting fires.
Yeah.
And then, so you've got like one type of gun which is really good at getting rid of shields, and another gun that's really good at lighting fires.
Yeah.
And so you hold off on the gun that is going to set things on fire because it can't go through shields, to turn off the shields and then catch a bunch of stuff on fire inside their ship.
Or like saving your like beam weapons until you
Yeah.
Or launch a bunch of robots into the enemy ship.
And then just sit there.
if you're like an enemy ship.
Yeah. FTL is one of the greatest games ever. It's such a fun game. But yeah, those are mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. And it's kind of hard to break them apart into their individual pieces. And some people like designing, so, hey, we want to get a specific feeling. How can we go about creating this feeling? Some people are like, hey, this is a cool thing to do. Why don't we do this a whole bunch and have it interact with stuff in order to and see what emotions that makes people feel. Like, I'm terrible at pronouncing the name, but have you guys seen that game where you roll around a ball and just pick up stuff on that ball?
Katamari.
That one is, the design of that game seems to be, from what I can tell, I wasn't there during the design process, a very mechanics-driven design process, whereas they had the mechanic of rolling around a ball, and then they're like, let's add on to this and see how that makes the player feel. And that is a really fun game from what I've heard. I think I've played it like twice. Whereas a game like, let's think about it, more story-driven games tend to be aesthetics, and then they'll build down into how we want the player to feel scared, like horror games. How do we make the player feel scared? Let's take away their gun. Let's make it where they can't see in the nighttime. I'm talking about the one where you're running away from stuff. Let's make it where they can only see through their camera. Let's give their camera battery life. And then those build together in order to get the feeling of what they're going for. And so usually when people are designing projects, they will either go, hey, what's an aesthetic? What do we want the player to feel? And how can we build this feeling? Or they'll be like, here's a cool thing the player can do. How can we interact with this cool thing the player to do in order to make an enjoyable experience, whatever that feels like? Yeah.
Does anyone ever start a design by thinking of a dynamic?
Yes, but usually if you're starting by thinking of a dynamic, you're jumping off of an already made game. So Sekiro, so like Dark Souls, a lot of like Bloodborne and Sekiro are more dynamic focused because they took mechanics and other aspects in the game that they already had and said, okay, let's, instead of focusing so broadly on parrying and dodging and shields and magic and all that stuff, let's focus on very closely on dodging and parrying. And those are like the only two things you can do in Bloodborne. There's other stuff, there's like some magic and that's hard to get. But it's mostly those two things, and then that creates a feeling of, oh, now since you can only attack and dodge and parry, then now it creates this feeling of a hunter going wild, and so they add in other mechanics to improve the aesthetic that they got from that dynamic. But there's probably other games, like whenever you just take like a platform game, let's do a platform game, but you can do this. You're two people tied together. You've created a dynamic, and then from there you'll get the aesthetic and the other mechanics that you need to add. But it should be possible, but usually if you're starting with mechanics, usually you'll have a handful of them, which automatically produce a couple dynamics. This is when you're playing games, it's a really good idea to think like a designer. And so whenever I play a game, I'm very critical of like the systems and aspects of the game that I don't like. And I don't like the stamina bar in Hyper Light Drifter. One, during the original hour of the game, it is not used for the most part. Two, when you start using it, it's this tiny little bar up in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. It's super hard to keep track of and see how much stamina you have left. And so it can disappear like that, and it's very important for a lot of your late game special abilities, but is completely useless during the early game, and it tells you about it, I think, once. So personally, I think they should have either, due to its value, they should have either made it bigger, since it's so important in the late game, and made it easier to keep track of. Similar to like the Dark Souls stamina bar, which takes up most of your upper left-hand corner of the screen. This thing can technically be there just for aesthetic reasons, that little white bar, when you're just dealing with it normally. Or two, you could have just removed... Huh?
It's not the pink bar?
No, it's this one. That's your bullets. That's your health. That's your stamina. So it's like, that one, it's like, you didn't even know which one I was talking about.
Yeah.
That's mostly my fault, but that little white bar up there, that fades and then goes away, and then once it's gone, you can't do any of your strong attacks, you can't do any of your special block bullets while they're going, and you can't do any of your special dodges. So you're very limited when that's gone, and it's not immediately clear that it's there. And so I think they should have either made it clearer that it's important, which would have affected the art style. It wouldn't have looked as cool, but either, as I said earlier, you need to tell your player that stuff is going on, or it would have, or just remove the stamina system altogether. I think that could have worked, because most of the things you need stamina for require a charge up beforehand. Especially the one that takes the most stamina is a charged attack. And if you're able to do a charged attack with guys attacking you, then you should be able to get it off. Whereas with this, the way it currently is, you'll go to do a charge attack and you'll just do a normal attack and you won't go to charge afterwards because you're out of stamina. And so it's a very nasty feeling when that happens.
Could they have also added the stamina bar when it got relevant? Like Wind Waker did that.
Yes, but even then, they probably would have, in order to get it to work. The problem isn't the fact that it's there the whole time. The problem is that it's really hard to keep an eye on during these games, as you probably saw earlier, have a lot of stuff going on the screen. This is the first boss, and there's already still just a bunch of stuff that you're dealing with at a time. And that little bar up in the left-hand corner of the screen, which is bobbing back and forth, which now that I've brought your attention to it, you can probably focus on, is not going to be the focal point of your attention, especially since the way the screen works, you can be in a bunch of different points within the screen. So like when he's down here, you're not spending time looking up there, you're looking at this bottom corner, because that's what you're dealing with. And so that's a very far distance, especially on like a bigger screen, between the focus of where you're looking and where the important information is. And this is a little bit more UI, UX stuff, but still important for designers to talk about and think about, because maybe you play test the game and you show it to people and they're like, I really don't like this aspect. And you're like, why don't they like this aspect? It seems to work. And it's because you're not clearly telling them how you're handling their interactions. And so this stamina bar, in my opinion, is not a very clear tell on how their interactions work. What time is it?
Ask is like,
Yeah.
to see if I'm understanding it
Yes.
properly.
Go for it.
Would it be like how in Smash you can't necessarily tell if you have your jumpers or not? And then like how, if you've ever seen Project M, how the way they addressed it was like, they added like you flash when you don't have your jump, like that'd be like the remedy to like, oh, you don't
Yeah.
really have the jump.
I think they do that in like some other Smash ones now.
It's not in
I haven't played Smash in forever. I'm so bad at it. My little brothers, they're like 10 and they beat me all the time. But yeah, that would be like hey, you're flashing because you don't have your jump. You can't. The super important thing, because you're falling off the screen of jumping, you don't have it. We're telling you in the clearest way possible. Smash is a bit difficult to do because the screen is taken up by 4 individuals, so it's really hard to do UI that's specific to you. The blinking one, I think, is a very clear one, like, hey, you're blinking, but like if it's completely zoomed out and you're just like a little dot on the screen, like some of the bigger Smash maps, it wouldn't be as clear as it could be.
It's something that they had in like the fan-made Smash one for Project M, but for some reason they don't have an actual one. That's why I was thinking.
Yeah, that's odd.
I'd say I think it would be a lot helpful if they added something in Smash that told you when your jump was on. I know my friend definitely died a lot of times to not knowing they didn't have a jump. Yeah.
I die when I have a jump, and I don't remember I have it.
But I think one issue is Smash already tells you a lot of things by blinking your character.
Yeah, like you're.
Like
Yeah.
when you're invincible, you're blinking. Like when you charge an attack, you're blinking, which gets very confusing sometimes.
Yeah.
Especially when my brother's playing Donkey Kong.
And the bars at the top of the screen in Smash would not be super useful for this type of thing because of how Smash works. You're moving around the screen a lot, so your focus. Usually the bars, you only look at that whenever you're down or whenever everyone else is down. And then you'll check and see, oh, I have this many lives left, or oh, I've got this many points. And so those bars would not be a clear place to do it, so it'd have to be on your character, and there's only so many things you can do with your character. But which is a problem that they ran into. They could probably do away. I think they have like different falling animations, but that's not always super clear. And running into like Smash, why doesn't it have this thing? As designers, we can go in and analyze. Hey, here's a bunch of different reasons why it might not be the clearest thing and not easy to implement it in a way that is satisfactory to us and satisfactory to the player. I'm doing 20 minutes. So one more thing, I don't have any slides for this because I looked and looked for pictures, but I wasn't able to find them. But I think Hyperlight Drifter handles choice in an interesting way. And a lot of games are built around choice. And usually you have two different choices in any situation. Usually there's like two types of choices. There's either short-term choices, which is more reaction. Like someone's coming at you. Do you shoot at them or do you dodge out of the way? That's like a short-term choice. And then you have long-term choices, which is, do I level up in strength or dexterity? Do I buy the super fancy armor, or do I buy the super fancy weapon? Those are more long-term choices of this is going to affect my playstyle for a long time because I don't have the super awesome armor, I just have the really big weapon. And so I'm going to be more attack-oriented. Hyperlight Drifter has shops, and in the early game, everything in it is fairly expensive, and so all of your choices will start having major effects on your playstyle. But as you get to the later game, and as you come to understand the game more, the short-term choices start to be more enjoyable for you than the long-term choices. So when you get to that later point, you've already purchased everything in the shops. So instead of having a bunch of long-term choices that you can sit around and take a long time thinking about which one I'm going to choose, you have a whole bunch of short-term choices that make the game more reactionary, and you have more options in every single situation. And some of these options are more doubled than like other options. So like when something shoots a spray of bullets at you, you can either dash through it, at which point you buy this mechanic and it gives you the ability to dash through bullets without taking damage, or you can you gain the ability to attack that power, which you aren't able to move, but you attack the bullets and they bounce back towards the person who shot them at you. And so you have two choices of how you want to interact with bullets, but you have to make that decision very rapidly. So it switches from long-term choices to short-term choices in a very interesting manner. Any questions about the nonsense I just spouted?
Is it? Would it also be better though to have long-term choices even later in the game?
Yeah. So Hyperlight Drifter is a very short game, and so as a result, and has very few mechanics. As a result, the designers, from what I can tell from just playing the game, I haven't read any of their stuff on the game, the designers probably didn't want to lock the player into one type of play style, because then they would have to make multiple types of play styles. So it's easier to just give everyone the abilities at the end, or just give everyone all the options and give them basically enough money to get everything, because if they were to slow down the amount of money they give you, it's basically just item, which is money. You get 4 of them, and then you get $1 or whatever. If they were to slow that down, then the feeling of reward for getting the money would not be as present throughout, and they wouldn't be able to have as many secrets areas that you could find that just give you one of those. And so they probably designed it in such a way that there's more reward than there is stuff to buy, which makes it more interesting to go out and explore, which is what the game's kind of built around. I think they talked about that they wanted this game to be like the original Zeldas, similar like idea of what they were going for. Obviously, slightly different art style, as you can see by the giant dying monsters. But they wanted you to go out and explore, and there's a lot of like secrets and hidden stuff, and that money is a very easily attainable award since there are so many secrets that you can go for. And so it's like, hey, we want this money, and if everyone's exploring everywhere, then their end gameplay style is going to be very similar. But if they don't explore, then they'll have a very specific gameplay style. Any other questions? I think that's most of what I was planning to talk about.
When it comes to the choice side of things, it's so just to make sure I'm following. For like, I'm going to go back to the case of FTL. It'd be somewhat like the battles would be like the short-term choice.
Yeah.
The stores where you buy typically the long-term choice.
Yeah. So like, basically, whenever you get an option to choose a bunch of things, like it gives you a text box and then it has the numbers that you can choose from there. That would be a long-term choice. Of like, okay, and like which system you're going towards, that would be more long-term choice. It has a bigger effect on your overall gameplay. Whereas in the battle, which compartment you're going to attack first, that's more short-term. FTL is kind of funny because it's simultaneously real-time and turn-based, depending on how quickly you press pause. And like, when I play the game, I'm always paused. It takes forever because I'm like paused 95% of the time. I'm like, okay, how do I want to fight this thing? And so it allows you to extend the length of your choices. The way I usually identify short-term choices, so this is mostly just me. There's long-term choices, short-term choices, and immediate choices. Immediate choices start to be less choices and more of reaction to, it's more of like a reaction time check. A lot of the times, like Dark Souls is full of reaction time check. Whenever you're like in a combat state and you need to react immediately, that's your reactionary. Short term is like, yeah, which place am I going to attack? And then long term is like, okay, where am I going to go in this world? Does that make sense?
Or like in Dark Souls, a short term instead of an immediate choice could be like, how do I get out of this fight? Using this flask or something.
Yeah.
I was more thinking about like in terms of like one is play style and like one is facilitator play style.
Yeah, that also is a way of doing it, a way of thinking about it. It's be more like, hey, do I want to have just a bunch of lasers that attack at once, or do I want to have a couple lasers and beams that can catch the ship on fire? You would build that up in your ship. That would be more long-term choices, and your short-term choices would be, what rooms am I going to attack with my laser beam?
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah. Weapons, shields, engines if they're trying to run away. Have you played FTO, Megan?
I don't even know what that is.
It's so much fun, and it's like $5.
I've played it like 100 times. I don't even remember if I won one time.
I haven't. I've never beaten it. No, I've never beaten it. I only have the first and second ship. I want more ships, but I don't know how to get any of them.
I just looked it up on the wiki.
Yeah.
it's hard,
It's a pain. But
especially
the same company that made that, or same indie group that made that, also came out with Into the Breach.
yeah.
And that is a very interesting gameplay. And it is designed in such a way that you can always tell what is going to happen from what you do. So basically, all the enemies say what they're going to do, then you take their turn, and then all the enemies take their turn. So it's a very interesting, and like, it's more of a puzzle game than a reactionary game. So it doesn't have a lot of reaction choices. It's more of just sitting here and going, how can I make sure none of these guys do damage to any of my stuff? I'm gonna end this stream because I'm mostly done.
I'm not sure why, but I played Into the Breach and it didn't.
Thank you for watching.